Hello. Welcome to another Understanding Town Government. I'm your host, Dennis Dostert, and today we go beyond the town of Guilford. Our guest today is Kevin Lembo, Comptroller for the state of Connecticut. He's a Guilford resident and loves this town. So Kevin, what do you do? What does a controller do?
Sure, Dennis. Well, first, thank you for the invitation to be with you today. You're not alone. A lot of people don't fully understand what the Comptroller is, does, or why we need one. So first I'll just say that the Comptroller is one of 6 constitutional officers in the state of Connecticut. We're elected every 4 years in the same cycle as the governor. So governor and lieutenant governor, secretary of state, treasurer, comptroller, and the attorney general is number 6. So I'm number 5 in that order, and that's our order that we appear in the Constitution of the state of Connecticut. And my job is primarily to set the accounting method for the state, to keep the state's books, to pay the state's employees. I buy health care for about 250,000 people. I run the core financial system, which is the enterprise system where all of these transactions, bills get paid, people get paid. I run that big system. And then I have another job that's unofficial, and that's as the state's fiscal guardian.
Okay. And there's a treasurer, right? The state has a treasurer?
There is. There's a treasurer and a comptroller in Connecticut.
How is a comptroller different than a treasurer?
Yeah. So in simplest terms, it's money in, money out. So if you write a check to the state of Connecticut, chances are you wrote it Treasurer, State of Connecticut. She's money in. She invests the pension fund. She takes care of the state's common cash pool. My job is to, again, pay the bills, pay the employees, buy the health care. So I'm money out.
What's they call a berserker or something like that at a company.
Right, I guess you could.
Yeah.
But what it does is serve as a check and balance on one another. So all of that control isn't in one person's hands, and we're able to be a check and balance on one another, and then to be a check and balance on the governor and the legislature.
Okay. And we say controller, but it's spelled comptroller.
Yeah.
Why is that? I mean, that's not English.
Well, it's not, and it's a completely made-up word, but a lot of words in the English language are made up. People often think that C-O-M-P-T-R-O-L-L-E-R, comptroller, is more in the public space, so government, and controllers, C-O-N-T-R-O-L-L-E-R, are in the private sector. And that's generally true until you run across someone who uses the other term. The comptroller in this case is, in rough terms, 2 French words that were mushed together. One who keeps the books, counts, and controls, keeps the books. And so that is the comptroller in the state of Connecticut. But it's C-O-M-P-T, and it's pronounced every which way but loose. Comptroller, controller, controller. So I answer to just about anything these days.
And there's some questions about what you know about how the state runs. And I know that we just recently had a kerfuffle about paying the bills in this state. And this state lived off of sales tax until the 90s. Then we got the income tax. Then we got gambling. But we still can't pay the bills. We still have a hard time with that. Why?
Well, so when you say we can't pay the bills, what that means is we are in budget deficit, and we have been for the last number of years. The bills are getting paid, though, as a practical matter. Yeah. It's important to point out that.
But everybody's always complaining about it.
Employees are getting paid, and the bills are getting paid. But you're right. Before the imposition of the income tax, you had a sales tax that was pretty high at the time. You had a lot of fees and user fees and taxes that all together funded the operation of state government. When the income tax was put in, the promise was, well, this will be the sort of the master account and everything will get paid out of here, and we won't have to nickel and dime everybody. But over time, governments grow, needs grow, unchecked additions to budgets happen, and suddenly there isn't enough money. Now, the other thing that's happened is not just on the spending side, but on the revenue side. So the old days, when the income tax was put in, most of the time, the financial markets would come roaring back, that cyclical nature of the financial markets. When they would come roaring back, Connecticut's economy and Connecticut's balance sheet, state government's balance sheet, would follow with it. We're sort of the caboose on the financial market train, right? So as things start to improve, revenue starts flowing back in because people have more money in their pockets and they're paying income tax. This time has been different over the last few years, and you can see it in the trend over the last decade or so. That correction or improvement in the market hasn't always led to that direct money coming back into state coffers, mostly because we are dependent to a large degree on the quarterly filer portion of the income tax, which is really folks who run a business under their Social Security number, or people who realize their income through capital gains and other elements of the financial market. And as that population in Connecticut has grown, has become smarter, has become more savvy to how to invest in a way that doesn't generate as much tax, revenue has fallen off in the state of Connecticut. The unfortunate part in all of that is that over years, legislatures and governors have gone back to those old places for revenue and thought, well, if I just increase this rate just a little bit more, then the money will come in. But that's simply not what's happening. So you have an economy that's reinventing itself. You have a recovery that is 92 months in at this point, and we haven't quite reached full employment. We're not there yet. And we need to be, dare I say, as a progressive Democrat, more conservative in how we add expenses back in until we're sure what that revenue stream is actually going to look like.
Yeah, don't. Yeah, I'm going to have a questioning about that again a little bit later, I think. But my perception, what I understand, is that Connecticut is one of the most heavily taxed states. Am I right about that?
Well, it really depends on how you're drawing that comparison. So property taxes in Connecticut are generally high, but so are they in New Jersey, as just to use one state as an example. They have an income tax, so do we. They generate income tax the same way we do. And I use them as an example because we're both so intimately tied to Wall Street because of our proximity and the people who live in our states. They also have a county level government that they fund through their taxes as well. So sometimes folks will compare state spending in Connecticut to state spending in another place without an appreciation of county level government and taxation that actually happens in those states as well. So what is not done by the municipality in Connecticut is done by the state. There is no middle of the road, and so unless you add all of that together, whether it be public employee headcounts or total revenue and taxation, you can't get a clear apples to apples comparisons.
With other states.
With other states. In some areas, our sales tax is lower than in some other places around us. And in other ways, our top rate among middle class taxpayers is probably higher than others. But then in the upper end is probably lower than places that have a tax on capital gains, for example, where we treat it as regular income.
The new tax that passed just recently in the legislature, people are perceiving that they're going to lose a lot, that they're not going to have the breaks that they used to have. What about that?
In the legislature or in the at the federal level?
Well, the budget that just passed, was there some new taxation in that?
No, the governor proposed some new taxation in his remediation bill that happened after the budget was passed. That ticked up the sales tax and did an entertainment tax and did some other things, but that's not a done deal. That hasn't been passed by the legislature yet. The big concern at this point for Connecticut around taxation is what is this new federal tax bill, or now law, going to do to Connecticut, where we will be capped on the amount of credit, for example, we can claim for taxes we pay at the local level for property.
What does that mean? Can you clarify that?
Well,
capped on?
Yeah, so right now you can essentially write off your property taxes on your primary residence. Now they've capped how much you can claim. Right. There are other pieces of that that are going to really treat Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, California, and some other states very differently than they're going to treat Alabama and Mississippi and some others. And I think it's time that places like Connecticut thought long and hard about this. Connecticut is a donor state to the federal government. We pay more money into the federal government than we get back. But right now, the majorities that are in the Senate, for example, are mostly out of debtor states, those that get more back from the federal government than they contribute. But yet they're making decisions that not only impact us, but actually treat us worse than others, and are going to lead to some real financial concerns for people in those states that are arguably more expensive states in which to live.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? But
yeah, I mean, look, when you take the ability to write those taxes off, as I just discussed, it creates a real problem for places like Connecticut, where we have a certain level of taxation, and it is argued that it is high, but we used to be able to actually take some credit for that on our federal taxes, and as that's being limited, it's going to put Connecticut residents in a very different place.
so we're going to have to.
We're essentially paying more.
Paying more, yeah.
Right. And the relief that's been claimed in that federal tax bill isn't going to help as many Connecticut residents as it is going into places where there isn't as much wealth, for example.
And so the federal government, even with the submarine base and all that, really isn't spending as much here in Connecticut as it does.
Oh no, I mean, look, we're up to multiple boats on order now. There's been a big uptick, for example, at Electric Boat and the submarine orders that are there. So from that perspective, places like Southeast Connecticut are actually doing very well, but their economy is so intimately tied to a single industry and a bunch of sub-industries around that they are really also victim to federal appropriation bills, because if the defense budget doesn't put in for that new piece of equipment, then those jobs go away. And there isn't enough backup and redundancy for those folks to go work somewhere else. If you're a submarine mechanic, it's not like you can go down to the submarine store down the street and get another job. Once those jobs are gone, you have to be retrained to do something else. And we've seen that cycle already happen.
Is Connecticut losing a lot of the base that it's had in the past for taxation?
I think we are seeing changes in the economy. It's important to remember that there's something about the Connecticut psyche that we always have to examine. And I don't know if it's back to our Puritan roots or where it comes from, but we're very willing to be very down on ourselves all the time. Like we're willing to, always look at the negative side of things. And I think you can look at the challenges that Connecticut has, but as you create solutions to what you're going to do about that, whether it's employment or revenue or transportation, education, you have to work from your strengths. And our strengths are many, and they include an insurance and finance industry that is actually very strong in our state, a manufacturing base that some people will tell you manufacturing is dying. Manufacturing is not dying. In fact, it's on growth in Connecticut. We have all of that defense-related spending as well that's lumped into that. We've got one of the most productive workforces in the country in this state. Our institutions of higher education, bioscience, it's really, we're very lucky in many ways. But what hasn't been done over the years is for someone to really get in there and coordinate those pieces, make sure that they have what they need. And I don't mean by the state giving away dollars to businesses just to stay and calling it economic development, but actually getting in there and trying to create an economic development atmosphere that leads to growth and gives business owners the assurances that they need to be able to grow or to come to a place like Connecticut when they recognize the strengths. And that doesn't even take into account this geographic strength that we have that we very rarely take full advantage of.
Geographic strength? What do you mean?
Well, I mean, if you're a company coming in from Europe, for example, and you are in the manufacturing space, but you need access to the capital markets of New York,
New York.
and you also need access to New England up through Connecticut, through Boston into the gateway to New England, then Connecticut's a great place to be for those reasons. But they're going to want a certain set of things available to them on the ground in order to make those big choices. And they are transportation, not only a car and road infrastructure that's kept up, which it hasn't been in 20 years, but also public transportation. They want to make sure that there's a talent pool ready to go to work. And that's really the job of state government, is to do those things. But for too long, state government has been overly involved in picking winners and losers in the marketplace, trying to figure out, what's the next big thing? Should we invest in that pizza joint or this pizza joint? It's really not a good use of taxpayer dollars. We really should be talking about broad-based economic development theory, and that is education infrastructure, and a state government that has its house in order. And we're not quite there yet.
I know, I heard you speak somewhat when you were considering a run for governor. And you had some ideas of putting money away for rainy days when the economy is well, and I think you said that hasn't really been done, that it just all gets spent all the time.
Pretty much. And look, when you consider the pent-up demand that builds when you've been in a down economic cycle, right? Local communities, for example, waiting to build a new school and can't get on the bond agenda to get the money. Or they need a gazebo for their green, or an infrastructure project, or some social service programming. When that demand has been building up, when the economy starts to improve, then the instinct of legislators and governors is to dive in that space and say, okay, you've been waiting, here's the money now to do that thing, without any appreciation or an unwillingness to acknowledge that we're tied to the financial markets. The financial markets are cyclical, and where there's a top, there's always going to be a bottom. So you have to prepare for those trenches in the economy as things go along. So you're right. I asked the legislature 2 or 3 years ago to tie their hands a little bit the next time the economy takes off, and force themselves by law to reserve cash so that they would have it to weather the next economic storm that's inevitably going to be on the horizon. A little bit of a hard sell, as you might imagine, because
that isn't the way things have been done before.
That's not the way things have been done. It's a little hard to say, I'm going to save this money for a rainy day, but I always call it fourth grade economics. You would get a $10 check from your grandmother, and your parents would say, you can spend $5, but you have to save $5. We have to sort of think that way. It's an oversimplification of where we are, but if that had been done, the proposal that I put forward, and we modeled the heck out of it and brought the best economic minds to work on it, if we had put that in place in 1991 when they passed the legislature, we would have weathered the last 2 economic downturns, recessions, almost without a blip, without tax increases and without service cuts, certainly. So what did we learn from that? Well, there's now a bill in place to take care of it, but these are all forward-looking things. Likewise, things like pension liability. There's a lot said about pension liability, but it always ends at, oh, it's too expensive, we can't afford to do it, without an appreciation that for 30 years, various governors of both parties, various legislative bodies have not made the full payments necessary to the pension fund that the independent actuaries calculate. And that is a basic responsibility of that kind of program. So what do? Then you got a pension system that's in the hole, and you need to figure out what you're going to do. So after we took care of that budget reserving and rainy day issue, I turned my attention to pension systems. And that's, frankly, Dennis, one of the reasons that I decided I didn't want to run for governor, because I like going deep on these issues. I like working on the detail, and I'm not very good at coasting along the top of a bunch of issues, and maybe I'm not the best at smiling at people that I'd prefer not to be with.
Do you have more to say about these topics that we've been talking about? Anything else that you would like to tell
Yeah, well, so engagement's got to be a big thing. A lot has happened in our state in the last couple of decades, and certainly a lot has happened in our country in the last couple of years. And I hope one of the takeaways is you've got to engage on some level. And that could be doing something like this.
Mm-hmm.
It could be researching a specific topic that you're interested in and engaging with a legislator about, whatever it is. That passive participation in our society means that others see an advantage and they dive in and take advantage of the vacuum that's created when we assume someone else is going to do it. So I hope whether it's volunteering locally, doing big policy projects, running for office, whatever it is, that people understand this is a great place. It's a great place to live and work and raise our families. We want to keep it that way. And the only way we can do that is if we all do what we can to make a difference.
Well, there is some light in that, Lately, since the last election, we've had a tremendous upturn in the number of people that want to volunteer to do things in town.
Absolutely.
So
it's really great news.
Yeah.
It's great news. I mean, look, as you said in the intro, I'm a resident of this town, and I do love this town. We chose it very intentionally because of its strengths and because of its people. But my work is mostly in Hartford. By the time I drag myself back to, to Guilford at the end of the day, there isn't a lot of time to, for example, volunteer on a board or a commission, or, my spouse does, but, I appreciate not only the folks who've been doing this work for decades in some cases, and showing up meetings once a month or more, and doing that all for free, but that new group of people who've realized now, I need to get involved. I need to do something. Yeah,
that's the engagement, I think.
It's wonderful.
We're talking about, and I just hope that continues on as the recent elections fade into memory,
Right, New Year's Eve resolutions are very rarely, right. But we've seen now almost a year of those folks that emerged after the last election staying engaged. Not all, but a good number. So that's a good sign.
It's a good sign.
Yeah.
Is there something else you'd like to offer?
No, look, so I appreciate always an opportunity to talk about the work that I do. It impacts not just state employees or retirees or people who touch state government in an intimate way, but people who really want their government to be high performing, want some confidence that people are really paying attention to this. I can't tell you how often we'll get calls or letters or emails from people, sometimes from Fairfield County, where I think they feel like Hartford is very far away from them, and say, nobody's thinking about this thing. It's like, don't kid yourself. There are a lot of good people and a lot of smart people, far smarter than me, that are working on these issues every day, and some confidence. And some gratitude to the public employees who do that work is a good thing.
Mm-hmm. You see, you've told us somewhat, that you see a positive light ahead.
I do.
Okay.
I do. It's hard. It would be hard to go to work every day if you weren't able to see the possibilities, and then to see a willingness on the part of legislators and governors to do hard things. Now, look, we all know that Governor Malloy is not the most popular governor that Connecticut has had in recent memory. But the narrow example of pension funding, he made sure that he made those full pension payments every year in his budgets. That is something that he gets credit for. I'm not trying to sort of say this has been wonderful and people just don't realize it, because it's been ups and downs over the last 7 years. But there are good things happening, so we'll see where it all ends up. I've got a re-election campaign coming up next year.
Oh, you do?
I do. 2018 is coming.
And of course, you seem to be right in there, ready to.
I'm ready to go and have the debate, but I've always appreciated the nonpartisan, bipartisan support that I've received over the last two election cycles.
And that's all for now. Good day and goodbye.